Imagine being chosen not for a job, not for an honor, but for your beauty. Imagine being 15, torn from your home, your parents' silent tears, the last memory you carry, as the palace gates close behind you. You are not a bride, you are not a guest. You are a possession now, one of many, locked away behind gold-painted walls never to leave again. Your beauty is both your passport and your prison. Welcome to the Forbidden City. Welcome to the world of imperial concubines. This isn't the romantic fantasy shown in television dramas or silk paintings. This is the true story, raw, painful, and hidden behind centuries of silence. Behind the grandeur of ancient China's most powerful dynasty lay a world designed to erase the women it consumed. Thousands of young girls were brought in, examined like livestock, and sentenced to a life of waiting for a glance, a touch, a name written in red ink. Some waited decades. Some died, never being seen. Some were buried alive to follow their emperor into death. And most were simply forgotten. But not today. Today, we open the doors. History kept shut. Today, we step into the shadows of the Forbidden City, not to glorify it, but to remember the women it was built to forget. She didn't choose this life. She didn't dream of becoming part of an empire. And yet one morning, she was taken. A young girl, barely a teenager, plucked from her home. Without warning, her fate sealed not by ambition, but by appearance. In imperial China, under the Ming and Qing dynasties, beauty was a sentence. Every few years, the Forbidden City held a selection process where thousands of girls were brought in from every corner of the empire. Unless already married or physically disqualified, no girl was exempt. It didn't matter if your family was poor or powerful, once your name was called, you went. Dressed in embroidered silks lined up like dolls, these girls were examined by officials for the most minute flaws. Skin blemishes, body hair, scent, posture, everything was judged. And even sleep wasn't private. Some candidates were made to spend the night beside the emperor's mother, monitored for movement, breath, or snoring. One wrong twitch could destroy your future. But passing the exam didn't mean reward. It meant surrender. Once inside the palace, the girls began a training regimen that wasn't meant to empower them, but to reshape them. They were taught how to walk without sound, how to bow at precise angles, how to smile just enough to seem graceful, but never arrogant. They learned chess poetry, calligraphy, not to express themselves, but to entertain a man they might never meet. For most, this training was not a path to glory. It was preparation for disappearance. Out of the thousands, selected only a few dozen made it to the final round, and from there, perhaps 3 would become the emperor's favored consorts. The rest would live in silence, trapped behind red walls, never leaving the palace again. Some would spend 50 years sewing in their quarters, waiting for a summons that would never come. They were no longer daughters, sisters, or individuals. They were imperial property. Their names were recorded once and rarely spoken again. They didn't become part of history. They became part of the architecture built into the shadows of a palace that still stands gilded and silent. Inside the Forbidden City, freedom was not lost, it was never offered. From the moment a girl crossed the palace threshold, her world shrank to a carefully measured space walls. She could not pass corridors, she could not wander, and a sky she could rarely see. Life in the inner court was not lived, it was endured. The palace was governed by an unforgiving hierarchy, one where a woman's rank dictated not only her clothing and food, but how she walked, how deeply she bowed, and who was allowed to speak her name. At the top stood the empress, untouchable in title but still caged by expectation. Below her, imperial consorts and concubines filled the layers of an invisible pyramid. At the bottom, palace maids and servants moved in silence, eyes lowered, hands folded, trained to disappear. But no matter the rank, they were all bound by the same rules. Every glance was monitored, every conversation overheard. The all-seeing eyes of eunuchs reported everything to the emperor's court. A kind gesture to the wrong person could be seen as disloyalty. A look held too long could be punished as seduction. Trust did not exist. Affection was a liability. And above all, rising too quickly drew suspicion. If a concubine did catch the emperor's attention, it was both a triumph and a curse. She would be envied, watched, plotted against. Before entering the emperor's bedchamber, she had to undergo a series of rituals, bathing inspection by physicians, a silent wait for official approval. Her name would be written in vermilion ink, a public record of private access. But that ink could also become a target. Political rivals, jealous consorts, even ambitious eunuchs could use that single night against her. And for every woman who was chosen, hundreds remained unseen, locked in their chambers with nothing but makeup, silk embroidery, and the quiet ache of waiting. Some waited years. Some waited lifetimes. The palace was a place of order, discipline, and beauty, but beneath the surface it was a machine of isolation, paranoia, and slow erosion. Here, silence wasn't just survival. It was required. Because in the Forbidden City, being noticed could be the most dangerous thing of all. Love did not belong in the Forbidden City. It was neither expected nor permitted. The emperor, though surrounded by hundreds of women, was not a lover, he was a ruler, and every relationship he held was a transaction of power, legacy, and control. Romance was irrelevant. Favoritism was dangerous. In the imperial court, even affection was a threat to the system. At the top of the hierarchy stood the empress, not because she was loved, but because she was law. Her duty was not to feel, but to maintain balance. She was expected to suppress jealousy, regulate the behavior of concubines, and ensure harmony among women, all vying silently for the same unreachable thing, relevance. Beneath her, concubines were ranked like ministers, each with an official title that determined everything from the size of their living quarters to the number of servants they could command. Even the color of their robes was dictated by status. But beneath the silks and ceremony lay a brutal reality. These women were not wives. They were strategy. Their bodies were vessels for imperial succession. Their emotions, if shown, were liabilities. If a concubine became too favored, it was seen as a disruption. She could be accused of manipulation, witchcraft, or sedition. History records many women who rose quickly in the emperor's affection only to be exiled, imprisoned, or mysteriously die. Jealousy, suspicion, and political sabotage were constant companions. Even a pregnancy could become dangerous. If the wrong woman carried the heir, she became a threat to everyone else. Some concubines went so far as to fake pregnancies or sabotage rivals. Others simply disappeared. Love in its truest form, mutual, voluntary, safe, had no place here. The emperor could visit a different woman each night and remain emotionally untouched. The women, however, could not afford such detachment. Their lives hinged on a single glance, a moment's attention, a child born at the right time. And when that didn't come, all that remained was routine pretense and silence. In this world, to feel was to endanger yourself. To hope was to risk heartbreak. And to love, that was the greatest illusion of all. When the emperor died, the women of his court did not mourn like widows. They braced for what came next. In death, as in life, they were not seen as individuals, but as property belonging to the emperor even beyond the grave. The passing of a ruler did not free his concubines. It cast them into even deeper shadows. Some were buried alive to follow him into the afterlife, entombed in silence, sealed into imperial graves as spiritual offerings. Archaeological excavations have revealed female remains surrounding emperors' tombs, women of similar age and status laid beside him like artifacts of devotion. Others deemed unworthy of burial were sent to desolate tomb complexes to live as mourners, caretakers of death. They lived in small stone chambers near the graves, tending to the grounds, burning incense forgotten by the living. The most fortunate, those who had given birth to sons, might remain in the palace, granted symbolic power if their child ascended the throne. The empress, too, was often allowed to stay. But for concubines who bore no children, life after the emperor was bleak. Some were exiled to remote nunneries, where they renounced their names, their past, and even speech itself. Others were left behind in the palace, cut off from the world, their rooms locked from the outside. In earlier dynasties like the Chen and Jin, childless concubines were executed, outright killed, as soon as the emperor passed, their deaths considered acts of loyalty. Not all dynasties were this brutal, but the pattern remained clear. A woman's value died with her emperor unless she had borne him an heir. Even survival came with no dignity. They were told to forget they had once worn silk, once been admired, once waited for footsteps that never came. Their legacy was to be silence. The empire didn't reward loyalty, it absorbed it. The walls of the Forbidden City, once gold, became gray, and the women who remained breathing but invisible became part of the architecture of grief. In the end, the greatest fear of a concubine was not death. It was being left alive long after her name no longer mattered. But not every woman faded into silence. A few against all odds broke the rules that were meant to erase them. Their stories are rare, scattered like forgotten lanterns in a pitch-black tunnel, but they burned brightly enough to be remembered. The most extraordinary of them all was Wu Zetian. She entered the palace as a low-ranking concubine of Emperor Taizong during the Tang dynasty. When he died, as tradition dictated, she was sent to a Buddhist nunnery, discarded, cloistered, erased. But Wu was not a woman built for erasure. She began a secret relationship with Taizong's son, Li Ji, her late husband's heir. When he ascended the throne, he brought her back into the palace, not as a relic of the past, but as a partner in power. Slowly, with cunning and relentless ambition, she rose through the ranks until she became empress, and eventually the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. She rewrote the system that once sought to destroy her. But Wu was an exception. Most women remained trapped. Some were given as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, transferred from one palace to another, from one cage to another, stripped of even the illusion of choice. Others were allowed to retire after decades of obedience, granted modest pensions or positions in palace laundries or kitchens. A few found spiritual refuge, becoming nuns by will or by force. And then there was Consort Wengxiu, the last to defy the system out loud. She was a concubine of Puyi, the final emperor of China, long after the dynasty had fallen. When he was expelled from the Forbidden City, she followed him into exile. But in 1931, something unheard of happened. She demanded a divorce. No concubine had ever done such a thing. Puyi, though dethroned, issued a decree demoting her to commoner status. She returned to Beijing, lived quietly as a schoolteacher, and died alone in 1950, unmarried, unacknowledged, but undeniably free. Her quiet rebellion marked the symbolic end of an empire built on women's silence, and though her voice was small, it carried the weight of thousands who never got to speak. They were never meant to be remembered. That was the design. The Forbidden City was not just a palace, it was a system of disappearance. Behind the red lacquered doors and towering stone walls lived thousands of women whose names were never recorded, whose faces were never painted, whose stories were never told. They were chosen, trained, and confined not to shine, but to vanish. Most spent their lives in quiet quarters, seeing only the same rooms, the same faces, the same flickering oil lamps, year after year. They were forbidden from writing letters, from receiving visitors, from stepping outside the narrow confines of the inner court. Some lived their entire adult lives without ever feeling direct sunlight on their skin. They embroidered robes they would never wear. They studied poetry they could never recite. They practiced grace in a world that offered no kindness. And when they died quietly in rooms lined with silk but stripped of love, they were often buried without ceremony. Their graves unmarked, their identities folded into nothing. History romanticizes the Forbidden City. It paints it as a place of luxury, elegance, and mystique. But the truth is darker. It was a theater of silence, a machine built to extract value from women and discard them when that value faded. Occasionally, forbidden romances did bloom, rumors of a concubine and a palace guard, a stolen glance between a eunuch and a maid, but these were rare and nearly always ended in execution. A few women risked it all, becoming pregnant in secret, hoping to pass the child off as the emperor's. But without DNA, truth was a gamble, and if discovered, it meant death for mother and child alike. Yet even with all this, many held on not to hope but to meaning. Today we look back not to mourn a lost age of beauty, but to honor the cost behind it. These women weren't ornaments, they were sacrifices. They were daughters whose stories were buried so the empire could shine. And though their voices were silenced, then we can choose to hear them now. because remembering them is more than history, it's justice. Most of the women who lived and died in the Forbidden City were never named, never mourned, never remembered. Their stories were not written in books, but buried beneath stone and silence. History erased them on purpose. But today we choose to remember. We tell their stories not to romanticize the past, but to confront its cruelty. Because behind every golden wall was a girl who once dreamed freely, who once had a name. And perhaps by saying it out loud, we give it back. They were born to disappear, but now through memory they rise, and this time the world is watching.